Hey there guys, Outlaw Dolphin here, and I just want to bring you a quick, hopefully, once again, quick discussion video about the Gladiator and the Centurion. Although we won't be talking about them specifically, I won't be talking about their fighting styles or anything like that. It's just an idea of hoping to answer a few questions as to, one, if we can hope for, or my preference of the Roman and the Centurion and the Gladiator being in their own Roman faction. Also, I'd like to answer why they are in the Knights faction to begin with, and if we could hope for Rome themed maps. Okay, so in my research into like the Roman Imperial Army and stuff pertaining to that era in time, I'm going to begin by answering why are the Centurion and the Gladiator in the Knights faction. And this is down to a reason that is nobody's fault. Not really, no, not even Ubisoft's fault. It's kind of history's fault. Roman efficiency and lack of diversity. Roman weapons and armour were so efficient that the Roman army very rarely needed to design anything new. Their gladius is a weapon that we see the Centurion use, is a weapon that was standard issue throughout the entire Roman army, as they would very rarely face any opponents, any enemies more heavily armoured than themselves. The gladius is perfect for it with its short range and its weight to pretty much get through any form of hide to fur armour. Also, their weapons in general, like they used a pilum, which is a javelin type spear, which in history had been used in hand-to-hand combat, but it was mostly thrown by those who used it as a javelin. So we can think of two heroes, the Valkyrie and the Gladiator, who both already use spear-like weapons, and then you already have the Nabushi, the Lawbringer, but these aren't like a Naginata or a poleaxe. These are spears. They're going to be thrown, if anything. And then there's the Pugio, which is a throwing dagger. Now we see the Centurion use this as a feat already, so then it would be kind of odd to bring it out as a feat for one warrior, but then a weapon for another. And then if we discuss their armour, the Lorica segmentata, which is made from strips of iron or leather, which also became standard issue, as it was best for deflecting most weapons and arrows. Okie dokie, and I just want to discuss also, I just want to bring up a few ideas that I've had for other Roman style heroes. If they were to bring out two more, I believe that they are best served by moving a Roman Centurion from being a hybrid, move him to the vanguard, and then move the assassin Gladiator, which I do believe is, so move the Gladiator into the hybrid, because him as an assassin is, I think, is a bit of a lie, considering you would expect assassins to be small and nimble, and they do show the Gladiator to be quite small-ish, particularly the female. When you have her against other heroes like the Lawbringer and the Raider, she looks so tiny, like the scale is just a little bit wrong. But a Gladiator was not an assassin, a Gladiator was a warrior. I'm surprised how a Gladiator is not that of a vanguard already, because they fight like Raiders, they fight like the Viking Raiders. Okay, so I have it here. So yeah, I've written that the Centurion should be moved to the vanguard, and that the Gladiator should be the hybrid. Now I was looking at what could fill in the space for a heavy and an assassin, and I came up with a few. For an assassin, there were these ranks in the Roman army. One was called a Velet, and a Velet looked very interesting. Velets were lightly armoured soldiers who wore little to no armour except a helmet, and they were decorated in animal skin or unique marks, so Centurions could recognise them and judge their skill in battle. There are also many others. A numerus which was a barbarian ally that was not yet integrated into the main army. The same can be said for a strange word here. Solararis. That's not my handwriting, that is indeed the word. Which was a hired mercenary. A Velet I could have thought would be perfect to be an assassin. Maybe a Velet would be perfect to being a hybrid. There was also the Praetorian, but that was basically elites. They would still use a Gladius much like a Centurion. So maybe if you was to move the Centurion into the Vanguard, you could rename him as a Praetorian. Then there was also the Triarii, which were a type of spearmen. And then there were Venators, which were huntsmen. But then it's the kind of idea of what you would give those new heroes something to fight with. Because Roman weapons and armour were not very imaginative. Only a Roman siege weapon, what they would use in the actual battlefields, or what you would call creative. But their weapons themselves are very straightforward. You know, you got your Gladius for your short range. They used bows and arrows, but then they used a spear for long range. They also have a unique little weapon here called a plumbata, which, if you was to think about it, is basically a leaded weight, heavily weighted dart. It was thrown like an arc, so it would go straight up and straight back down. It's kind of like your early mortar, where you just kind of up it goes and down it comes. And then then you've also got their Scouten, which is their large rectangular shield. Now I've often thought that maybe they could have brought that in some fashion, as I believe there is a feat called Phalanx for the Centurion, and that is to just simply give your teammates armor. But if they could have brought up a hero which uses the shield itself, you're kind of looking at something like a Conqueror with the ability to defend, but then again you might expect some turtling from something that might use a shield the size of a man. There was also a Parma Equiestis, which is a round shield, but then you could compare that to what a Valkyrie or the Warlord uses. So that's just the idea that each, because I looked up each rank and what each kind of warrior would use in the Roman army, they would all very much use the same weapons. It's very straightforward. No matter which rank you were in the Roman army, you were probably always going to have the same type of armor. The Lorica Segmentata could also be scaled instead of just simply iron strips or leather strips. There was also a scaled look to them as well. Just basically layering up, just like making each layer tougher to get through. Considering that they also wore tunics and other stuff underneath their armor would already make them very heavy. And the question of why they are in the Knights faction, and this has led me to believe, is there a lack of creativity for the Knights faction? Because we all know that Ubisoft have not explored the entire chivalrous code of honor that a knight is. There are many forms. What we have, the pragmatic warden, and then we have the lawbringer. I'm looking at the weapons primarily here. If you think of the warden's longsword, then compare that to a peacekeeper's short sword and dagger, then you've got the conqueror's flail and the lawbringer's poleaxe, which, you know, you can look at that and just think they've explored almost every single route you can take for what you'd expect on the battlefield in from the last 1,000 years, from say Middle Ages to at least the 13th century, 14th century. But I thought what might be interesting to bring to the battlefield is that of rapiers or estocs, some form of piercing sword that could provide a fighting style similar to that of the Nabushi, that kind of straightforward where it kind of looks like they're just coming straight at you, that there's no real difference in direction. All the attacks just seem so at you that they don't really seem like they're coming at you from an angle like laterally or horizontal. Then I also thought of sabers as well, which is something that's very Mediterranean or very Middle Eastern back in those days. If you think of anything from like scimitars to falchions, which you would see in mainland Europe stretching to Middle East. And then there was this is a personal favourite, and if they could bring this up would be nice, is the Taj and Dirk. Now Taj is normally a spiked shield, but sometimes it can be paired with a dirk, which is either giving it some form of protrusion or spike on the centre of it, which would then make it primarily for shield bash, and you could use it for blocking, could also be used for sword breaking. But then there were also other ways to use this, so you could just literally have the shield, but then your shield hand is then holding a dagger, so you could go from a parry block into a counter, and then you could come down hard with a strike. I thought that would be very interesting to see in For Honor. I imagine it would be very similar to like a parry counter into a skewing bleed, which I think would work most. It's something that we're seeing with a lot of heroes. The Peacekeeper has always had it. Being able to guard break and then pierce with a bleeding attack. Then the Valkyrie has always had a parry counter into a skewing attack. The Gladiator has many, and the Nobushi has always utilised bleed attacks in her repertoire. I don't believe that there is a lack of creativity for the Knights. I do believe the characters exist, and I just think Ubisoft need to look just a little bit harder, or they need to get creative with it. I understand, I do have other reasons why the Centurion and the Gladiator. I won't call them Romans because we don't really know if it's a Roman Empire. We know what they're styled upon, but we don't know what they are in game. Not really. The only thing that we do know for certain is that if you look back to the trailer for the Centurion, it says, "Some fight for warlords, they fought for an empire." That's just my idea for what we could expect if we was to get that sort of empire, Roman Empire themed battlefield. Like you could see it in Siege, you could have the Colosseum, you could have the sacking of Rome. You know, something that we have to believe in the lore of this game, if there is a lore, because there is a story, is that whatever the Centurion and the Gladiator, wherever they fought before, wherever they're from, probably does not exist anymore, at least not in a state where it would be livable. If by in some fashion it was also cursed by this doom that came to us all, you could also say that, you know, it affected them in the same way that it affected the Knights, the Vikings and the Samurai. And just other points on can we expect to see these Roman style maps? Realistically, I'm really just gonna go out there and say no, unless they do make a full Roman style faction, because I expect this new Wei Lin faction to bring some maps to the table. We kind of get new maps every so often. I think like Gauntlet and Sentinel are some of the newest ones, and they're great. They are definitely bringing new style, like the traps on the bridges for the Gauntlet, but we've seen something similar with Overwatch. But then Sentinel, clearly to me, has probably been the stepping stone for this whole new game style in general called Breach, because that brings the ballistas to the map, seeing if people would take to them. Now the ballistas have been useful. They pretty much make that map. Very difficult whether to take C or A, which one's going to be more beneficial to you. A is very exposed but has 2 ballistas, whereas C is very blocked. It's very well shielded from ballista attacks but only has 1 ballista, so they balance the map quite well in my opinion. Okay guys, and finally I just want to talk about one final addition to this video, to this discussion, and that's the problem with adding new heroes and the creativity that comes along with it. Is that my belief is that an entire faction needs to focus on one culture, a way of life, or its fighting style. Now each faction that we started off with in the beginning, that we still have, the Knights, the Vikings and the Samurai, they all have their own fighting styles, they all have their own way of life and their culture, which is also being brought in with the Wei Lin faction, believe me. Ancient China had its own way of life separate to feudal Japan. They are same, but they have their own differences to make them worthy for their own faction. It is also my belief that the reason for the Roman and the reason why Gladiator, because it's written all over my notes, the Gladiator and the Centurion are in the Knights faction is because they are. The reason for them being in the Knights faction is because, like, a Gladiator and a Centurion, they come from the same way of life that we see in the Knights faction. If not the fighting style, because I do believe they are different, but a Knight's way of life is very similar to that of a Centurion's. They were to serve a higher purpose. Each Centurion would then serve their Centuri, Decanus, Praetorian. The ranks go up and up, all the way to the Senate, or whoever was in charge at the time, if you think of like your Caesars and your Neros. Which is something that the Knights can be said for doing if they follow a form of royalty. Now the Knights that we see here, they follow oaths, but we don't really see... We see warlords, but we don't see royalty, we don't see kings, queens, anything like that, unless they were all before the Doom. Which is... I'm saying the Doom because that's what we see at the beginning of the game every time we switch it on when we hear Apollyon's story. The other idea to this is that each new faction that comes along will bring new weapons. Now if you look at the Wei Lin faction particularly, they have more exotic weapons that are used in more versatile ways. Like if you think of the twin hooks of the Nuxia all the way to the gun of the Shaolin, especially the Dao and the Guandao. They, like, sure, you can look at the swords and just see like slashing weapons. But the twin hooks are going to be used much like a shinobi. I can imagine them moving in much the same way. Except I would expect a Nuxia to be very much more aggressive than a shinobi, and that frightens me because I've seen aggression from a shinobi and it's hard to deal with, particularly from someone who's using it so well. I imagine a Nuxia will become most frightening indeed. Like if you look at Vikings, you see their weapons and you can tell that they use them in very aggressive ways. The Berserker and the Raider for sure, definitely the Shaman now. And then Samurais, who are very precise in their movement. Now you only need to look at every single one of their faction, apart from maybe a Shigoki, which you could err as closer to that maybe of a Viking, but there is precision. There's not much aggression, just pinpoint, and there's no energy wasted here. If you look at the Orochi, the Kensei, and definitely the Nobushi themselves, they don't really fight in aggressive ways, they just fight faster and more precise. And finally, if you look at the Knights faction, which is a faction, you know, that I have, you know, it's my faction, but I've, just looking at it on the war map just kind of makes me think, okay, more people seem to choose the Vikings and the Samurai. Now, I'll understand that a samurai's way of life, Bushido, is a very envious way of living. I'm going to talk about a movie at the moment, but if you think of Tom Cruise's The Last Samurai, you see that Ken Watanabe's performance in that film is so serene. The way that he talks to someone, particularly like Tom Cruise's character, when they're talking about what each person has experienced on the battlefield, and yet Ken Watanabe's character can sleep soundly, but Tom Cruise's character suffers from nightmares. Say that, you know, the way that a Japanese warrior fights is that they fought for something better than themselves, like a knight. They served a family above them. They would serve like their shoguns, or they would even serve the emperor directly. And they would know that their actions were for the sake of their people. Whereas, you know, you could say the same for Tom Cruise's character when, like, his character suffers nightmares from like raiding Native American camps at the time, and he would just think of the horrors. You know, like children dying and stuff like that. They didn't single out. They would never kill anyone. They would kill everyone. Like no one would be spared because they all viewed each other in a very bad light. You know, combat in like the way that American cavalries were fighting Native Americans was that it was very much an eye for an eye. You raid our camp, we will raid yours. You kill our people, we will kill yours. Japan, particularly the samurai, just had a way of looking beyond it. It's almost just like they were on a different plane of reality in a way of experiencing a battle. Nothing clouded their judgment. But back to the knights, because I got distracted from that. Knights are literally, I would believe that they are technique and ability to move for what their armor allows. If you see that a warden kind of looks, when they do their shoulder barge, you kind of see that they are throwing their weight, but they almost lose control. Definitely a conqueror, when he's doing his shield bash, he loses his balance. A lawbringer definitely throws his weight around. They are very strong, but they are strong because it's what their armor allows them to be, because they are literally clad in metal. The armor does the work for them, and so do the weapons. There's no real creativity for it, much like a gladiator Gladiator's completely different. For a Centurion, definitely. They let the weapon do the work. The Centurion that we see in-game will use his fist. I can't say if that is something that was, you know, if that's how each Roman soldier fought back when they were learning to fight. They really much looked like they would let their shield and their sword do the talking, that their own physical prowess was not part of it. That is very much a gladiator. A gladiator would have to be strong, considering their way of life. Some of them were either slaves or they would volunteer to fight in the Colosseum or in arenas around Roman Empire at the time. So yeah. So yeah, I think this is the reason why we will probably not see a separate Roman faction. Not now that they've already been inducted into the Knights faction. You could almost say that the Romans have to be considered a sub-faction, something that will never be unique to themselves. They will never stand alone. They will never stand apart from the Knights, but they are in the Knights faction, and I think they will be there to stay. You know, it just kind of seems to me that the For Honor, the game, seems to go hand in hand with a slightly old, not super old, but 5 to 6 years old TV show back in the day called Deadliest Warrior, which would literally just pin like, oh sure, let's have a Roman Centurion fight him, let's have like a Japanese samurai fight a Roman Centurion and see who's best and stuff like that. It was very good, it was very entertaining, but it just seems to be that that's kind of what the game is following. Oh, we just want to include these people and these people. I won't be surprised if one day we just see pirates and hand cannons. I hope not, because I think that will spoil the idea of the game, but it just seems to be that that's what they were doing when they brought in a Centurion and a Gladiator. So let's say, well, we have two ideas, but like we can't really come up with anything else because, you know, it's just Romans didn't have much in the way of diversity in terms of their weapons. Very much so on the battlefield. They were very smart. They were very creative in how they used their weapons. But that was because their weapons were so simple, it just allowed for that such versatility. As for Roman maps, probably not going to be a thing. but could be in time. And then just, you know, with the whole idea of bringing in new factions, they have to support one way of life, one fighting style, and, you know, just the culture just has to be focused on one culture. Okay guys, so if you have any questions, if you'd like to put anything in the comments down below, if this style of a discussion video worked for you, please give me a like or comment down below on what I could have done better. And yeah, I'll see you for the next one, guys, and sorry that this took so long for last Wednesday not being a thing. Just writing down a script for me just seems to take just a little bit of time. Okay guys, thank you, see you, have a nice day.